welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Young-Gyo Kim. South Korea's Ministry of Unification released shocking and disturbing photos of the two North Korean defectors who were forcibly deported to the North Korean side across the inter-Korean border back in November 2019. And South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol's office vowed to uncover the truth behind the case. Meanwhile, on the sidelines at the G20 meeting, the US, South Korea, and Japan discussed efforts to enhance trilateral cooperation across the Indo-Pacific and around the world in support of the shared values amid challenges posed by China and Russia. Today, we'll discuss these and more.
South Korea has an excellent legal system, and the individuals can be put on trial, and that's a more balanced and appropriate way of handling it.
I think there needs to be, and you did reference it in your testimony, a very serious investigation how that could happen, because that is antithetical to everything about human rights.
In the studio with me is David Maxwell, Senior Fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies and the Global Peace Foundation. Colonel Maxwell was a planner for the United Nations Command and the Combined Forces Command. Also joining me is Scott Snyder. Mr. Snyder is Senior Fellow for Korea Studies and Director of U.S.-Korea Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. His book, South Korea at the Crossroads, examines the trajectory of South Korean foreign policy. Welcome to the program. Good to have you both.
Thank you.
So up until now, most of the criticism about the forced repatriation of the North Korean defectors has been towards China. Colonel Maxwell, what do you think about the current situation where South Korea is being suddenly criticized for being the party concerned? Is South Korea being derailed from the values it shares with the United States, such as freedom and human rights, for this moment?
Well, certainly South Korea can be criticized for its actions for forcibly repatriating the two fishermen. I think that really is a terrible incident, and it does, put a stain on South Korea. However, what I think is really important is the fact that South Korea is really demonstrating that it's a strong democracy. It's recognized that it had a problem, it made a mistake, and now it's investigating. And it's going to determine accountability and take appropriate action and ensure that something like this doesn't happen again. So, in fact, while it is a tragic event and something that is quite shameful, I think when you look at it in terms of a democracy, only a democracy could admit its mistakes and take corrective action. And that is the real difference between China and South Korea, and of course South Korea and North Korea.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Snyder.
Actually, I think that this particular issue goes all the way back to the origins of the conflict and the attempts to provide resolution during the armistice negotiations. And so what is really important about this is that it is a betrayal of a principle upon which the armistice was negotiated. All the way back in 1952, we delayed by over a year getting to a ceasefire over the issue of voluntary versus complete repatriation. And President Truman at the time provided just a damning critique in that regard, saying that doing anything other than that would be a violation of our humanitarian and moral principles. And he said that to buy an armistice by trading human beings, that he would not do that by trading human beings to slavery or slaughter. Mm-hmm. And so in many respects, I think that this incident raises those issues and contradicts a longstanding principle that goes back to the core of the difference between North and South Korea.
U.S. Congressman Chris Smith released a statement saying he was shocked and dismayed by what happened. The level of his criticism was quite high, and he even pointed out the episode underscores the callous complicity of the previous Moon administration. Mr. Snyder, the fact that a U.S. lawmaker would use such phrases toward an ally, does this reflect this big shock palpable in Washington?
Well, I think that it reflects the position of the congressman who is really raising the flag in terms of moral and human rights values on the part of the U.S. But I don't necessarily consider it to be a criticism of the alliance because he is criticizing an act by a prior administration. And frankly, I don't think that he used those words when that administration was in power. But now it's a time of reckoning as related to that action. And I think the congressman is standing on his principle.
Colonel Maxwell, we do sense some disappointment from congressmen, though, don't we?
It did not allow due process, and it did not act within the rule of law, its own law, its constitution recognizing all Koreans as citizens of South Korea. It should have thoroughly investigated the allegations at the time and taken whatever action was necessary based on the legal process. But instead, I think that it was a function of the misguided policies of the last administration seeking to curry favor with Kim Jong-un to try to jumpstart North-South engagement.
For the first time in decades, the U.S. Congress held a hearing last year about South Korea's human rights issues. The hearing was prompted by the enactment of the anti-leaflet law, and last month there was also another hearing examining South Korea's refugee policies. And South Korea was often referred to as a model democracy in the U.S. Colonel Maxwell, do you think there's some change in South Korea's status as an ally who shares values with the United States?
No, I think our alliance is strong. I think we share values. I think the Korean people in the South absolutely share the values. These are universal values. They're inalienable rights. I think what happened, what they looked at in terms of the anti-leaflet law, again, that goes back to the last administration, reacting to rhetoric and threats from the North, ostensibly, using the rationale that they had to protect the Koreans in the South in the frontline areas from threats from the North. But really what it indicates is complicity with North Korea in preventing information to go into North Korea, because that's an existential threat to Kim Jong-un. He cannot allow information and knowledge about the South flooding into North Korea. But we're seeing the Union administration now, place the right of freedom of expression above this really anti-leaflet law that should be, and likely, hopefully, will be found unconstitutional. And if not, hopefully will be overturned by the National Assembly.
Well, it is a little bit unusual that a congressman would necessarily point to a flaw in an allied country, but I think that also it's the case that as fellow democracies, we should be strong enough to be able to take constructive critiques. And I think that there were issues raised at the time related to the leaflet law. It revealed that the policies of the two governments were out of line in terms of the relative prioritization of human rights versus reconciliation. There is, I think, a need, as David has suggested, to rectify a law that remains on the books. And I do think that this issue is a potential point of conflict between the new administration and an opposition National Assembly. And so that is a matter of concern, that this issue can be polarizing and can really drag down the South Korean body politic. But The fact of the matter is that we're also striving to uphold democratic ideals. If South Koreans criticize the American democratic process, especially at this moment, I think that Americans should be thick-skinned enough to take it.
To restore the values shared by both the United States and South Korea, how would you suggest this specific issue of forced deportation of the North Korean fishermen being resolved? Mr. Snyder.
Well, I personally think the main lesson is don't do it again, solve the problem that existed. And I believe that the Yoon administration is committed to doing that. With regards to digging into precisely the motives and blame for exactly who did what in the past, well, I can understand why an investigation might be necessary, but I also think that there is a limit to what can be accomplished through that investigation at this time.
The Yoon administration has the opportunity to do the right thing, to conduct a transparent investigation, not a witch hunt, to identify what happened and hold those accountable properly in accordance with the rule of law. And I agree 100% with Scott, is to make sure that this never happens again. This is something that China does, that North Korea does, that this is not something that South Korea, the United States, any democratic country should ever do. So it was a mistake that was made, but again, I commend the Yoon administration and the Korean people in the South for admitting that there's a problem, recognizing it, and acting to rectify it properly in accordance with the rule of law.
If I could just add one thing, what these pictures show is that this is what refoulement looks like. And so we should be very conscious that even though we don't see pictures of what happens on the China-North Korea border, this is a routine practice that occurs. And to the extent that we are outraged by what we see, we also need to recognize that there are many cases that we don't see, and this should actually mobilize us to action in that regard.
Very good point. I'll move on to the next topic, which is about the trilateral cooperation among the US, South Korea, and Japan. This seems like it is much more stressed in Washington these days, and as there are more occasions that the US needs to confront China and Russia, a polarity is naturally being emerged between the US, South Korea, Japan, and China, Russia, North Korea. Colonel Maxwell, do you agree with the argument it puts South Korea in a more unstable position given that the country is located at the junction of the two united fronts?
Yes, well, South Korea has always been in a difficult position, but I think what is more unstable is trying to walk that tightrope between China and the United States. And I think what we're seeing here, though, is South Korea recognizing that it is a strong democracy, that its security, its prosperity lies with not only democratic nations, but the rules-based international order. And what we're seeing is the revisionist powers of China and Russia, the rogue revolutionary powers of North Korea and Iran, they're attacking that international system, the rules-based international system. And I think we're seeing that countries are lining up, to determine not what is best for others, but what's best for themselves. And I think that South Korea has come to the realization that its alliance with the United States is important.
Mr. Snyder, is South Korea seen as walking on a tightrope between the US and China?
Under the Moon administration, perhaps, but I think the Yoon administration has been very clear in voicing its preference for alignment with the United States. It's voiced the centrality of the US-South Korea alliance as part of its foreign policy. And this presents a challenge, I think, for Yoon as he tries to develop a relationship with Beijing. And I do believe that there is a difference in terms of the way that the Yoon administration is describing its hopes for its relationship with Beijing compared to the way that the US is talking. But I think that the Yoon approach at this point is prudent, and I think that in Washington, just because South Korea might find areas that it might be able to cooperate with China on that we can't, it doesn't necessarily mean that we should begrudge South Korea for doing that. Broader issue, though, that you raised, I have to say, it is a structural challenge. because we see greater alignment between China and Russia, and we see North Korea falling into line with China and Russia. And then with regards to South Korea, it's natural, I think, under those circumstances, that a like-minded country, a group of like-minded countries is going to align in opposition to that. And so the challenge is that South Korea has to adopt to a new environment, which may be a little bit different from the environment that we had seen 5 or 10 years ago.
Then, to follow up on that, what is the expectation that Washington has for Seoul in terms of South Korea's role in supporting the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy and efforts to defend the rules-based international order amid this rising tensions with China and Russia?
Well, I think that American expectations for South Korea are expectations for alignment. And I believe that the Yoon administration so far is meeting those expectations. There is a lot more to be done, I think, in terms of the way that the Biden administration is framing and developing its expectations for what alignment means. And I see not only South Korea, but also Japan and other countries in the Indo-Pacific actively working to try to meet that set of expectations.
I'd like to go back to something that Scott said. If South Korea can forge good relations with China, that's not in opposition to U.S. interests. In fact, I think that is very good if they can have good relations with China. But I think that South Korea recognizes the challenges that China poses. And while it tries to forge good relations, it really has to stand for the rules-based international order. And I think that's what President Yoon is doing. I don't think we should think of South Korea as just aligning with the U.S. because of the alliance or because the U.S. asks it to do so. I think it's going to align with the U.S. because of our shared values and because it's in South Korea's interest to do. But again, it will conduct its own diplomacy, and diplomacy with China is not in contravention to U.S. interests. If South Korea can maintain a stable relationship and reduce tensions because of its diplomacy.
I'm sorry to jump in again, but I think the key here is that our shared values between the U.S. and South Korea don't always mean that we have precisely coinciding interests. I do think that as regard with China, we have largely convergent interests, but it's important, I think, especially in Washington, for us not to expect that South Korea is always going to be in lockstep with the U.S. We do expect alignment, but I don't think that it's prudent for us to anticipate that South Korean interests are always going to be precisely the same or viewed in exactly the same way as the U.S. views its interests.
Some South Korean critics say it's not in South Korea's interest to be dragged blindly into U.S. and Western front against China. So, Mr. Colonel, it is a valid argument.
Yes, it's a valid argument, but I would say that South Korea is not being dragged blindly into a relationship. I think it's acting on its own interest. It made the strategic calculations, and because, as Scott said, our shared values really drive that alliance. It is not big brother, little brother. It is not that we are able to tell a sovereign country, South Korea, what to do. We have aligned interests, and South Korea has recognized those interests. So it's making a calculated decision to step up in the world, to no longer appease North Korea, to strengthen the alliance, to be engaged in the Indo-Pacific and around the world. Those are South Korean decisions by this administration. And much of those decisions align with U.S. intentions and desires. So there is no blind dragging in this. It is wise decision-making by the South Korean government.
Mr. Snyder, so nobody's dragging South Korea to anything?
No, I don't think so. In fact, let's try to make this a little bit more specific. South Korea has had a lot of trade with China and has had built up a lot of expectations for participation in the China market in various sectors. But what has South Korean businessmen discovered? They've discovered that China is limiting the opportunities for South Korean companies to gain market share. look at the story of Hyundai Automobile. 10 to 15 years ago, they had a much larger share of the Chinese market than they do today. So should it be surprising that the Hyundai chairman decides that he wants to build a plant in the United States instead of in China? Well, based on the relative, business logic of trying to make that decision, I think that South Korean private sector and government are making a logical and rational decision based on their own calculation of interest.
More specifically, it is watched closely how South Korea will conduct if a military collision occurs between the US and China or the US and Russia. Japan, for example, has been hinting it will aid in any Taiwanese defense against China. And former Defense Minister Mark Esper told VOA in a recent interview that it's hard to conceive of a conflict between China and Taiwan that the US gets involved in across the Taiwan Strait that somehow doesn't involve Japan or Korea in one way, shape, or form. So, Mr. Snyder, do you think this would be true?
I think it is true, and the reason why it's true, it's complicated. It's because the U.S. has bases in Japan and South Korea, and that means when we're talking about military conflict, it's going to be natural that China is concerned that the U.S. might use those bases to its advantage in responding to a conflict. And so there are risks for Japan and South Korea as related to the hosting of bases. But I think those risks are outweighed by the vast benefits of the security commitment that the United States has offered to Japan and South Korea respectively. And I don't think that those benefits are necessarily diminished by the, at this point, shared commitment among all three allies to supporting peace and stability across the Taiwan Straits.
Mr. Snyder just said that the risks of hosting the US military in the territory is outweighed by the benefits. Do you agree with the view?
Yes, I absolutely do, because our alliances really contribute to national security and prosperity. And I think we've seen that over the last 70 years. It is the combined military presence, both U.S. and South Korea and U.S. and Japan, that has really deterred war in the region. In regards to Secretary Esper's comments, South Korea depends on the sea lanes of communication throughout the Indo-Pacific. So if there is any conflict in the South China Sea, South Korea is going to be vulnerable, and ships will be at risk. But I think also if there is a conflict between China and Taiwan, I think the ROC-US alliance will remain also focused on North Korea. Deterring a North Korean attack, especially in times of other conflict, is paramount. And so I think that we will see South Korea and the United States increase readiness and to be able to deter attack from North Korea if they choose to act out while China is conducting operations against Taiwan.
Japanese news media reported South Korea's Foreign Minister Park Jin is visiting Japan soon to meet with Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida, as well as Japanese Foreign Minister, as the two nations are seeking ways to thaw their icy relationship. Amid the continued calls from the U.S. for the closer ties between the two Asian allies, we'll have to keep an eye on how South Korea and Japan will set out the possibilities for further partnership among the three countries. Mr. Maxwell and Mr. Snyder, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And that does it for this week's Washington Talk from Voice of America. Please join us again next week for more analysis.